be the host today of this digital risk in the post-pandemic era. I'm running the cyber business unit here at Webos, in charge of both the product and the strategic business. Leonard?
Good afternoon, good evening, wherever. For myself, it's actually 1 a.m. Thursday morning for me here in Australia. Thank you for the opportunity, Leron. Looking forward to the conversation here with my student colleagues.
Great. David?
Good evening. I'm David Nordell, also in Israel, so it's 6 o'clock in the evening, not some ridiculous time at night, although I'm accustomed to working those hours. I'm now a cyber strategy consultant. I have basically a one-man consultancy. This is after being in a cybersecurity think tank for the previous 5 years as the head of strategy and policy there. And I basically look at cybersecurity in the context of what's happening in the world, less from a technical point of view, although I'm certainly familiar with the technology. I'm looking at what kind of risks there are, what kind of threats there are, how the stakeholders need to face up to these threats. And I'm very much looking forward to the conversation, and I hope I will learn something from my colleagues in this.
Indeed. Thank you. Demi?
Hi everybody. My name is Demi Panari. I'm currently the CTO and the co-founder of Panarrays, and we're doing third-party security while helping companies to manage the cyber risk from their supply chain, business partners, and other third parties affiliated. Coming mostly from the background of engineering, I used to serve in the Israeli Air Force, and I work closely with the Israeli Air Force's intelligence unit. I basically developed a missile defense system, and then I worked at a company called Windward doing maritime analytics. So also in the past few years, also working closely in the context of big data and cybersecurity. So I come more from the world of tech, but we took that heavily in the world of cybersecurity and assurance of whoever you're giving away your data to.
Interesting. Great. Thank you, guys. So I'll explain what is in the menu. So we did a basic overview, but we want to talk about COVID-19 and the cyber risk. Indeed, it's a subject that is so popular, you can find it in Google with 100 million results, but still it's important to discuss and explain, and maybe we can share a few examples from my end for sure. Financial risk. As you know, financial services is one of the leading industries where the money is. So the cyber risks are following it. Next will be the public sector, governments, locals ones, healthcare institutions, educational, and more. We'll discuss and overview different cyber risks that relate to that. We'll discuss, of course, the mitigation and the recon, how we can gather intelligence, how we can be prepared holistically, robustically, and more. And of course, a few words about the future and what we can do in order to protect ourselves. So, speaking about the COVID-19, I must say that I saw, at least at my end, and when we talk about dark networks data, I see more and more organized cyber groups exploiting the fear of people. I see a lot of spear phishing, okay, which is commonly used to lure targets, and then they collect different type of credentials. One of the common one is Office 365. Themes that I heard are around health updates, fake cures, fiscal packages, and emergency benefits. It's amazing. Usually you can detect them by different types of poor grammar, generically address people, dear sir, dear colleague, etc. I mentioned the spear phishing, but there are more types of exploits that you can use. Some of them were also ransomware, and they are AML and CDD. I would like to hear you guys. what you have to say. Maybe you can share a few examples around the COVID-19. Leonard, please.
Certainly. I think one of the things that we've seen that's certainly quite interesting is that COVID hit us, and what we saw for a lot of organizations is this accelerated or fast track of digital transformation. A lot of organizations had a contingency planning, business continuity plans. They enacted that. And the biggest part of that was ensuring that the business stayed operational. And that meant ensuring that they could keep their workforce productive and executing. So immediately, first and foremost, I think front of mind, fast track of digital transformation was absolutely prevalent. Hand in glove with that, obviously, is all the associated digital risks that traditionally comes with digital transformation, getting significantly heightened now as these organizations try to move quickly to enable their remote workforce and other things like that. So therefore, heightened risk that came about, and obviously some of the things you're talking about there, whether it's phishing or what have you, right through to things like disruption of global supply chains, both from a demand type perspective. Certainly, the world was embracing a new way of executing in terms of living, playing, learning, and conducting business.
I see. Thank you, Leo. David, please.
Well, I would add to what Leonard just said. There's a very big difference between the way most big companies, global companies, have organized themselves for not just digital transformation, but for coping with digital risk. And the rest of the world, which includes small business. I'm very familiar with one global high-tech company because my wife happens to work for it. I'm not going to mention its name, but
Sure.
in a company with about 100,000 people worldwide, they were able to move very rapidly and very efficiently to having more than 90% of the workforce working from home using encrypted VPN and having very, very small groups of people in their offices. So the offices are almost completely closed. And they are functioning very well. And they're functioning very securely because they have a security strategy that they've implemented effectively over many years. And by the way, the security strategy until now has been both physical and cyber together. They've had a single CSO. And this is, of course, a great model, but it's not a model that everyone is capable of replicating. It's partly because most small organizations don't think that they can, and they don't realize that a lot of the security tools available can be implemented on a small scale. And for that matter, they don't realize that they can train their staff. And by the way, this also applies to a one-man organization, which has to train its staff just as well as a 100,000-man organization for dealing with the digital risks. And I think that the bottom line of digital risk is actually human in most cases. It's that people are too willing to believe what they see online, on the screen, what they read. By the way, it's the same as what they were typically believing on television once upon a time. And even before that, I remember one of the world's was a radio broadcast many years ago. And people were calling into the BBC in absolute
David,
panic because
we hear you breaking.
what they heard was
You're breaking. David, you're breaking. Maybe you can improve.
They believed that this radio fiction broadcast of an invasion from outer space was actually happening. And the problem in all this very digital risk is that people are stupid. I'm sorry to put it as bluntly as that, but people are extremely stupid sometimes. And they're particularly stupid now because of what's happening in the world, which is, by the way, not only COVID-19 and number of thousands of people dying from this terrible disease, but also other things happening. There are other risks that people are aware of. There's huge panic, not just in Britain, but actually around the whole of Europe, around Brexit, including how is it going to influence the survival of the European Union. There are other risks to do with the People's Republic of China, particularly what else might they do, particularly if they really had engineered this virus and what's going to happen next. There are risks to do with a probable trade war between the USA and China. China is in any case in the middle of taking over Hong Kong. So people, once they're frightened, become more and more irrational. And that makes it a lot easier to exploit them.
Well, I agree. Under crisis, I saw people in panic that actually are willing to buy in $10,000, at least I saw it in the darknet, plasma blood, if you know what it is, and they are willing to pay for that. I mean, and when somebody presents it as a cure, they will do everything to buy. Amazing. But let's give a shot to Demi to explain it more his point of view. Yes.
Yeah, so by the way, I highly agree with David. I say that we're, as human beings, as the employees of the companies, we're the stupid factor of the company. And that's it. Like, it doesn't really matter how much awareness you actually have to cybersecurity and all of the threats, you would still click a discount about something. Like 95% of people would actually click that. So maybe you'll have some kind of mitigation actions, an EDR solution or something that might, I won't say prevent, but at least like detect that. But eventually we end up as being the weakest link in the chain. And when I say we, right now, we spoke about the whole context of enterprise risk, right? When you're shifting your whole company to work differently. So your people are like shifting, moving, right now working from home, they left the premises. So we talked about like physical security being like, and yada, yada. So we can talk a lot about that. But in the example that David gave of a large organization that kind of like shifted that because they've invested a lot of resources. And I saw a lot of like really large companies that did that well, really, like they invested that effort, even like maybe with the consultants that helping them to shift the way that they work. But what happens with the long tail? Okay. And kind of Leonard mentioned the supply chain in general. But right now, all of your service providers had started working from home. Because of that, I like said, globally, things have changed when COVID like hit. Because right now, people communicate differently. I'm not saying like, you know, Zoom, Microsoft Teams or whatever. They communicate differently because they're more open to do different things that they weren't open to do when they were on premises. Meeting people, like doing a lot of meetings, communicating. I have a lot of examples of things that happened to me as, you know, like somebody that is talking to people on the day-to-day basis that shouldn't have happened ever. It's like barging in a room full of people talking about the financial state of a company. And I will talk about it later, I think, in examples. But right now, when your supply chain had shifted also to working from home and it's the long tail and they don't have enough resources to actually invest in cybersecurity, this is the problem. And why? Because basically your perimeter today has expanded to all of your supply chain, even when you're working on-prem. Because right now you're passing away your most confidential information to different kinds of service providers. And I'm not saying even like, you know, MSPs or things like that. I'm literally speaking on all of the platforms that we're using. I would ask Leonard, okay, you're working at a large company. Let's take, right now we're using like GoToWebinar. Do you see them as a critical supplier right now or a critical third party?
Oh, absolutely. As you said, nearly every one of these organizations has turned to some form of digital collaboration service operations, period. So awesome. They become one of one facet of your critical assets and supply chain, 100%.
And I would mention why, because right now, first of all, this is the way of communication and providing your service, because right now there is no face-to-face meetings or like much, much less, okay? And not only that, they're literally recording all of your calls. Right now, all of the calls and all the most confidential things that you're passing away information-wise in your company are recorded. And don't even like go, no, but I'm not recording this call. Okay, yeah. That's exactly. Nobody is listening ever.
No, that's
in
that's a really important point you've actually raised there, and some of the conversations I've been having with various people have said, oh, I mean, it's really good to hear from David that there's examples of organization that they're able to move swiftly to maintain operations. But some of the conversation that you've just raised, one of the really important points, is that have these organizations in place a rigorous assessment of whatever collaboration tool or service that they're going to use.
Yes.
Your point, the service that your organization is using now, for argument's sake, has been assessed to determine whether it enables end-to-end encryption. Has been assessed as to where was that collaboration service hosted, in which jurisdictional or legislation region is it? Do you have the ability to delete all those recordings or information or data that that particular collaboration service is collecting? What are their T&Cs with regard to that service around whether they, in you using their service, do they reserve the right to then share that data with other third parties?
Exactly.
Guys,
totally
That's
new.
also legal. That doesn't even, like, technically, that doesn't really matter.
for sure, one
I
thing for
agree.
sure, we have a lot of questions. We have a lot of complication in one single range of a moment. Due to this pandemic, we started to ask ourselves much more questions, and it's starting to be complicated. For sure, we'll touch also the mitigations right after that, but let's move on to the financial services. Okay. So if we'll talk about, you know, insurances or banks or even different types of financial services, professional financial services like PwC or Deloitte, they are very, very popular in you know, in targeting for cybercrime. We see it a lot in the dark networks. People that are mentioning different types of brands, trying to find the back doors. There is a lot of social engineering, a lots of fraudsters in this area, including phishing and malware attacks. You know, very nice profiling on a targeted person in the financial sector, understanding what he likes, finding the right wording in the email, and that's it. And you're inside
Yep.
this machine, and from there it's pretty easy, RC and so forth. There are also, if we'll take it even to the other side, there are insiders. Okay, eventually people that are part of the organization that actually steal or doing some kind of cyber vandalism. In some of the cases, it's an unsatisfied employee or something similar. But I would like to hear you about that, Leonard.
Sorry, Lauren, you broke up there.
Oh yeah, so I just want to hear your side of the story about different types of financial cyber risks.
Actually, I can give you one that is kind of close to my heart with regards to a risk / a scam that has been perpetrated recently. My background, I'm a career public servant until I flipped to what some would say the dark side. But I spent over 20+ years in public sector, all in IT and cyber. And I worked for what I like to say is everyone's favorite federal government institution, the tax office. Okay, and recently, in the last couple of weeks, actually, we've had a lot of media around scams associated through the federal government scheme was set up to allow Australian citizens to access some of their superannuation money, like the US 401k type thing, to see them through the period. And there was a process there to go through, and it was administered through the tax office. And in the last few weeks, we've seen there's been a number of these scams where the miscreants, having identified this opportunity, have taken the time to understand the system, how it works, etc. What are the credentials you need, etc. And they've actually launched a number of attempts masquerading as citizens,
Wow.
try and then scam that money out of the superannuation system. You can get up to 10,000 initially, and further 10,000 later in the year. So that was really interesting to sort of see that one pop up, because I just want to make it clear that wasn't the scammers or the bad guys coming in and hacking that system. This was more what I like to call an abuse of the system, where they took the time to learn how the system functioned, armed themselves with the right credentials. Now, those credentials, we've just been talking about lots and lots of available stolen creds out there. So they've obviously managed to get hold of a treasure trove of the right personal identifiable information and credentials, and then they've started to abuse the system, but using ill-gotten credential and PII in this case. So that's something that definitely has hit the news here, and you can imagine that it's created a lot
and
of.
10 million. How much time it took to identify this breach? How much time?
The tax office were fairly in terms of identifying it, because, for example, one part of the system requires you to answer certain questions, simple things like your mother's maiden name, but it's more than that. Okay, so when people were trying to get through the system and were failing consistently on that particular criteria, would have raised a flag that required, say, some extra vigilance or extra level of authorization and things like that. So they were reasonably good in the way they actually detected it, and then they managed it down to, you're talking in the end, there was only about 150 of these incidents that were of, let's say, more serious nature. Okay?
I see.
So this,
cool. David, anything to add for the?
Yes, I do. Well, first of all, I have been defrauded more than once in major London banks. Actually, in 3 different major London banks, and in one case, I was defrauded twice in the same bank using more or less the same method. Okay, I got the money back eventually, but that's not the point. What I discovered, and I have a lot of background in the field of financial crime, particularly anti-money laundering, know your customer processes. The banks like to talk about how they're tremendously secure, and they're using all of the best technology and so on and so forth. But my experience was that all of the security fell down because of not just human error, human sloppiness, negligence, people not doing the job properly. Someone went into X bank in London with what appeared to be my credentials. And was able to persuade the bank. The second time, after I'd already instructed the bank to put additional security barriers on my account, they were able to take the money out again. And I'm talking about a lot of money, because of pure sloppiness. And no one pays the penalty. And this has got nothing to do with using technology.
So only using credentials, David? No other authentication method? That's it? Amazing.
Someone with a passport that was supposedly mine, definitely wasn't. I never let my passports out of my control. I have 2, but and in all these cases, what I saw was that the banks were saying, no, it's not possible. We have all of these controls, and we are carrying out know your customer checks, and we have technology, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, even one of these banks, which is now using voice recognition, I very much doubt whether the voice recognition works well. Certainly in terms of photo identity, it doesn't work well. It's very easy to fake photo identity. It's very easy to fake video identity as well. By now, I think we certainly all know about deep fakes. And the truth is that the technology that one needs to discover a deep fake is not so trivial. One's got to actually have a serious investment in the technology that's at least as great as the investment made in creating the fake. And so what's happening in a certain respect is that the financial industry, at least in facing the consumer, is taking on a false advantage. Saying, we have all the technology and it can't possibly be done what you claim. And in almost every case, it can be done and is being done, and people are losing money unfairly because the banks are not doing their job properly. Now, this is true for consumer banking, business banking. When it comes to investment banking, it's more difficult because usually the sums are bigger and there's much more reliance on actual technology rather than human intervention. But even then, we see plenty of examples of things going wrong. I mean, one area of digital risk in investment banking that very few people are aware of is that if you can interject a small delay in the data stream from a data supplier to the investment bank, you can actually defraud the system. Because the timing of an investment transaction is critical. In some cases, we're talking about milliseconds.
You mean
If
like
you
a
can,
payload for the request itself, something like
yes,
inside the payload to add something? Yeah, nice.
I'm not talking about inside information. I'm talking about the ability to simply manipulate the trade.
The trade, yeah.
Including that you manipulate the rate at which a trade is actually carried out. And so there are lots of things happening here where you've really got to be a deep insider in order to understand all of the possible things that can go wrong. And they go wrong all the time. And naturally, we're also talking about, the other things. There was a famous case many years ago of someone who was able to basically copy the pattern of someone's hand on a keyboard in order to defraud an anti-fraud system. And
David,
this happens all the time.
It's amazing, but let's give Demi a shot if you have anything to add in this in this angle.
So I would say something really like strengthen what David said. Okay, if patch management and misconfiguration were MET's problems today, 90% of the cybersecurity industry would be out of the job. Okay, and because these things are always happening, eventually every other if it's a graph of the world, and every vertex that you opens up new exposure and new risk. And because of that, like every communication that you do, for example, a bank right now or any financial service, and I highly agree, by the way, that kind of like in the UK, from what I'm feeling also from customers, UK and the United States kind of woke up, the whole financial industry kind of shifted to working from home, and immediately new risks got exposed. And you started hearing during COVID a lot of like third-party breaches that occurred to service providers that are providing services for the financial industry. For example, I heard it from 3 different entities from the fintech world. Okay, one fintech company, one bank, and one insurance company, all from the financial industry. A mutual vendor of theirs got breached. Nobody heard about it, like it wasn't like outspoken, but it's a service that they're using to manage their own internal things. And it's the same service, by the way, that they were using when they were on-prem. Same one, okay? Same company, same everything.
Amazing.
Again, only what shifted is people do not see each other like face to face.
Right.
And then eventually you start the aggregation of all of the other things. And I'm seeing that vastly in the financial industry.
I'll be back in a couple of seconds.
Sure.
David, you're breaking?
No, he said he needs to go somewhere and he'll be back really
I see.
soon.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't hear it. Well, okay. Okay, so I think let's do a fast over the public. I think the public sector, we actually mention it in various aspects. So here again, we are talking about different local and central governments, healthcare and educations. Usually the people have low awareness of any type of cyber risks. The architectures of their systems is based on centralized machines and servers and databases, and only recently they are starting to distribute it over different IoTs and devices. Again, it exposes another vector of risk. Okay, and I don't even need to mention different types of supply chains, because if we are talking about local governments, they have many subcontractors over and over, and the human factor repeat itself. So I will just, with your permission, skip this one and go straight to the mitigations, because we talked about all these, I would say, beautiful risks, but still we need to find a more holistic and robust approach to defend our organizations, our customers. So, basically we can just think about the human factor. We need to train him and to do simulations and education and bring the awareness. In some of the cases, we need to adapt the cyber solution per organization, a small one, the distributed one, etc., etc. One of the things that, at least from in my at my end, I feel that is strongly can help is the recon, the intelligence gathering. Be prepared. Not only in the tactical level. See the dimensions, see the discussions about your brand, about your services, and be prepared for the next vector attack, because they are evolving. The crimes and the criminals are evolving all the time. And of course, the proactive approach for monitoring and mitigating. But let's hear you, Leonard. Mitigations that you think are important to mention?
I concur with everything you said, in particular around the whole concept of preparation. And for myself, for roughly 10, 11 years, I was responsible for the incident response capability for the federal government institution I was at. And I absolutely agree. Preparation certainly makes a huge difference when you come to execution. Being prepared, though, also touches on to one of the more important things that you talked about, and that was about doing the simulation things. So one of the things, if I can pick one thing, I think that is highlighted through this pandemic period, is that organizations need to revisit how they actually execute in times of crisis for managing incidents and so forth, because quite frankly, a lot of it was designed, their process, procedures, all the rest of it was designed with having staff on-prem, etc. Now, they've got remote staff everywhere else, distributed everywhere else. So they need to start by looking at what do they need to do in terms of revamping their policies and their processes and their procedures and how they execute. And having done that, it's absolutely critical that they have to test those processes, whether they do a series of paper tests, tabletop tests, simulation exercises that maybe even encompass some kind of red team, blue team activity, because it becomes absolutely critical to ensure that your processes are effective, because you don't want to be using new processes that you've developed in the midst of a serious real-time incident and then find that you've got gaps or inefficiencies in that process. So one of the things that
I want to ask you something, with your permission. You are talking about simulation. Now I'm trying to be realistic. I mean, do you see a large company doing real simulation for all their employees, the HR, the marketing guys? I mean, they will say, what the hell? Why it relates to me? Why it's not only the cybersecurity guys, etc., etc. So how we really make them aware of that? I mean, it seems to me a bit strange yet.
Well, there's a couple of things you can do there. What I was focusing on was ensuring that your first responders, whether they were your cyber, whether they were your problem management, people, the execs involved in the system. So when we used to run a simulation, you'd spec it out, and then you would have all the right people. For arguments, you're doing a tabletop exercise at the table, and then you run through that exercise there. With what you're saying there, in terms of, say, someone from marketing. It could have been marketing and comms. And one of the things we always had was a good relationship, marketing and comms, because quite frankly, when you need someone talking to media, you do not want your cyber folk talking, because they're the wrong people. So you need to have marketing and comms people involved in that process, getting them to the table and getting to understand why it's critical that they are there to assist you, the organization, in times of crisis. Okay, now that's part of that preparation process that you talked about.
Okay, cool.
David,
are you there?
Oh, sorry, go on. Go on.
If I may add something to this. I've been particularly interested in the subject of post-attack response, because I take the attitude that eventually you cannot prevent the attack from taking place. Some attack will inevitably happen successfully. So what you do about it? So I've spoken quite a few times about crisis management in cybersecurity, including at a conference on healthcare and pharmaceutical industry cyber a few months ago in London. And I made the point, I hope successfully, that since the attack is going to take place anyway, you need to be prepared for it. You need to have a crisis management team set up in advance. They've got to be trained in what to do. They've got to have a briefing book. They've got to have everyone's telephone numbers. They've got to know where all of the equipment is, right? Including the keys to the safe. So that if something goes wrong, they can talk to not just the media, but the shareholders, the regulators, the government, whoever else is a stakeholder in the success of this company. And by the way, also the union, which might be a major stakeholder, so that you can minimize the damage and you can show a level of responsible behavior to all of these other stakeholders. One of the biggest problems, particularly happening now in the field of cybersecurity, is that there are a lot of regulators involved. If you, in the United States, particularly in the state of New York, if you are a public company and you have a cyber attack, you have to answer to the regulators. And they can be very savage. It's part of the job of regulators to be savage in many cases. And if you can make it clear to them that you did everything right, you had all of your plans in advance, you dealt with all of the different interests correctly, then you might still get fined, but no more than that. And probably quite a small fine. This applies, by the way, to GDPR, all sorts of other regulatory issues. GDPR specifically says if you are successfully hacked, but you have done all the right things and you respond correctly, then the fine is likely to be 50% of the worst case. And this is, I think, becoming international best practice. Perhaps unfortunate to use the word best practice, but still, this is the way it is. So if you can understand, and by the way, this also means that you need to understand what the risks of your business are. So another talk that I've given several times is how do you essentially red team your own organization? Not in terms of technology, not in terms of how do you actually implement the hack, but what are your key processes, your key data, your key people that can all be attacked? And how do you minimize the risks of these attacks taking place successfully? It's basically, it's military planning, essentially. And I'm sure that Demi in particular understands this because of his Air Force intelligence background. You need to think in terms of how does the enemy look at your organization and how is it going to try to attack you? If you do all of these things successfully, then you're likely to minimize the risk significantly.
Always minimize, but not to zero. Demi?
Right.
There is no zero.
Of course,
I agree.
we know that. But Demi, can you share, maybe from your experience, an example even? I mean, without mentioning any names?
Okay, so I would again, David, I highly agree with like at least 99% of the things that you say. And I would strengthen what you said. All of these like annoying policies.
I need to know about the 1%.
It's
1% because there is no 100%.
3 out of
So I
3,
have to say
guys.
something close to that.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so in general, the context of all of the policies and annoying things that we do in the regulatory part of it, they mean something for some reason, okay? And once you take that to an actionable thing and something that it will yield in the response part of it, okay? Even the NIST CSF framework kind of like talks about it. What happens after, okay? Like the recovery part of things. This is also important to mention. And by the regulations that you've mentioned, GDPR, NYDFS, also in the context of the financial industry, the New York Shield Act that came out right now, and all of that thing, CCPA, all of these things came to kind of like protect the way that you're doing things. Okay, as as a derivative out of it, you have lots of like processes that you need to put in place to kind of respond to different things. And I would give the example also, like, because I spoke with Laurent about it. Uh, it's like fresh, okay? Like 3 weeks ago, specifically in Israel, this happened. Really like a known service provider, hosting service provider got hacked, and they got defaced. A lot of customers are using this service to actually host their own websites. And what happened there was basic defacement of the websites. Okay, of course, I want this, but it's WordPress. Okay, and we can all like talk hours about like different kinds of vulnerabilities that are out there in the WordPress. But put that aside. Okay, right now what happened is that service provider, that hosting provider, is a fourth party of a lot of third parties. So in general, the customer, okay, or for example, the security practitioner that needs to do this kind of audit process of other entities that are holding his data, right now got breached. And the employees, which we mentioned, the stupid factor of any organization, access the hosting provider's service that he provides to the third parties. So what happened in this defacement process, besides the embarrassment, okay, there was a drive-by download there. Okay, and initially when you're accessing through the mobile, it kind of like prompted you to download a malicious APK. And again, think of it on the masses. Okay, even if it's using like this hosting provider is being used by a third, or like even a small percentage, under 10% of your supply chain, eventually somebody will click. Okay,
For sure.
and this kind of exposure, it's external to your company even. So for example, at Panorays, we're offering continuous monitoring on yourself, on your vendors, on your business partners, etc. Eventually, if you don't have some kind of automation tool to actually recognize this thing, and who are your third parties automatically recognized, and who are your fourth parties, which is like a really, again, I don't know how you do that without automation. You can't even identify that something happened. Who will alert you? Okay, the employee feels like embarrassed that he literally like gave permission to his camera and somebody took a photo of him and it was uploaded to some kind of database. I would feel embarrassed. I would never say that. So how will get this kind of notification? With what kind of solution? So basically doing the continuous monitoring and doing that in scale is important. On whom? On yourself, enterprise risk wise, maybe third party risk. So everything is a risk-based approach. And once you have some kind of mitigation controls according to things that you might identify, even in the dark web, even in different like areas, assembling a picture, a landscape of your digital footprint on the outer perimeter is really important to identify the possible security gaps. Of course, you need to prioritize everything because you can't tackle everything. Nobody has an unlimited resource, especially not for security. Okay, we're the annoying people of the organization. So having that, you need a risk-based approach to actually take that, and of course mitigate whatever is important, whatever hits your business. And once you actually justify that on the context of the business side of it, everybody will pour money on you. Okay, so, yeah, of course, like install that EDR, install everything. That's basically.
I just want to be sure that we are, summarizing, because we are really in the last step before you share another story, maybe. So, Demi remind us all the risk-based approach to prioritize, to take everything in a more calculated way, and find your main vectors, and based on that to protect. But maybe something from your end, David and Leo, something that you feel that could be the approach looking forward?
Reducing the human factor, although I've been involved with technology for many years, I think that we've got to be careful about relying on technology too much, because it's very easy to make technology malfunction through even false assumptions about what it's supposed to do, or how to make it do what you think it's supposed to do. Coming back to the human factor, Demi, you mentioned the word embarrassment a couple of times. So one of the most important lessons I learned about security actually was not from a cybersecurity speaker, although it was at a conference where I was speaking about cyber. He was the last commander of the air wing of the last Royal Navy aircraft carrier, although there's now 2 new aircraft carriers. And he said that their security culture was based on no blame. In other words, you can make mistakes, you can discover someone has been completely idiotic. No one is going to be punished ever as long as the mistakes are admitted and investigated and corrected properly. If someone tries to hide something, that's a different story. And this is particularly true for cyber, because most of the things that go wrong are the result of human error or human sloppiness or whatever. We've got to make sure that we have a culture in the world of cyber where if something goes wrong, you admit it. You don't need to feel that you're going to be thrown out of the company because you did something stupid, you clicked on the wrong button. And the problems will be solved cooperatively. I think this is one of the most important human factors. And I think that this is also, in a sense, a holistic human factor, because it's dealing with the one thing that makes us not want to admit that we messed up.
And adding to that, transparency. Transparency is important. And because of that, like what you mentioned on the thing that let's investigate, I take that also from the Air Force, like literally investigating everything and trying to like implement whatever corrective measurements possible, important. And also like giving the ability to feel free about like notifying things, because again, you have lots of blind spots, and because if somebody won't tell you, you won't know 90% of things.
Absolutely. Eventually, our employees, people are like agent that you install. I mean, if you share the information, eventually you'll know it. But Leonard, do you have anything to add?
I got 3 things, because they only add to what my esteemed colleagues have said. So adding to what Demi said earlier, risk-based approach, absolutely agree. That is fundamental to the way we execute. To be able to effectively undertake a risk-based approach, though, any organization needs to identify their crown jewels. They're going to identify what are their critical assets, because that obviously will be where you deploy your 80-20 of your resources towards that holistic monitoring or extra vigilance. So knowing where your data is, where your critical asset and data is fundamental to undertaking that. So what Dave said earlier there, I think that one of the things that is critical that goes with that no blame culture is that there's a great opportunity for everyone in any organization at the end of any incident or lessons learned. And to me, any incident that you have, whilst it may be a painful, traumatic experience as you triage and remediate it, do not ever miss out on the opportunity of lessons learned at the end. They're the nuggets of gold that you can use to then possibly enact, say, some kind of security hardening program or improvement program, so that that same particular problem doesn't come back and manifest itself. Lessons learned. And the last thing I want to say, I think we haven't sort of touched on it, but I think that encryption is going to play a significant part in terms of how we safeguard our organization forward. You know, you look at what my 2 colleagues have talked about. the various sort of incidents and breaches and all the rest of it. By those third-party scenarios that we just heard. Okay, if organizations had employed some level of robust encryption of their data in transit and at rest, then if something happens at that third party, you, as long, obviously I'm presuming here that your organization have a effective key management system in place. You put in the keys and your data is encrypted. You can more or less go, okay, not a great situation, but we know the data is encrypted. It's just gobbledygook and anyone gets all of it now.
Absolutely. And don't forget to back up. Okay, very important.
Absolutely. So I had a quick story to reinforce what Leonard just said.
Really,
a few years ago,
on 1 minute, because we really need to finish. But David, last story.
So a few years ago, MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service, was carrying out an operation against narcotics smuggling in South America, and they had a list of all of the contacts on a memory stick, which was in the pocket of the field operative, and he lost the memory stick, and it was not encrypted. They had to abort the entire operation, worth God knows how much money and how much human suffering as a result of this very simple, stupid mistake.
Amazing. So there are many stories, and there will be more in the future, but it was really, really interesting to hear all these approaches and, you know, your point of view of all these types of risk and threats. It was a pleasure for me. I hope you enjoyed as well. And thank you. I want to thank you for this lovely session. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure and a
Thank
privilege.
you for hosting, guys.
Okay, cool. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye.